Laura Longo Rodriguez is leading a session on policy and biodata sharing presentations.
Okay, thank you, Terry, and I will do my best to reach through the screen as needed to keep us to time. So this has been a great lineup so far, and I'm really confident that the next speakers are going to add just as much rich information to the conversation and many important things for us to think about as IHCC going forward. So I'm excited to hear from them. I want to take a quick minute before we get going, just to again acknowledge the colleagues I have on the Policy and Biodata Sharing Working Group, and to again invite anyone who's interested in the things that we've been talking about, sees other policy issues from your perspective that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that we do, or again is intrigued by the topics that we're going to hear about from our speakers, because I really do think in how we've put this panel together that what we're trying to do and what's going to happen is highlight areas where there are other efforts going on around the world, looking at some of the same thorny topics and challenges that we're confronting as IHCC trying to move our science forward, that others are confronting and similarly trying to work on to move their scientific initiatives forward. And so, as I mentioned yesterday in talking about the draft policies, we're constantly on the lookout for places that we can leverage and collaborate with others and bring to bear their unique position to work on topics and our unique position to work on topics, so that we can identify and articulate solutions to issues where they're needed as efficiently and creatively as we can. And that is what we're going to hear about today from our speakers, and again, get some ideas of where we might be able to collaborate or take advantage of the work that their groups are doing going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Benjamin Neal, who is from the Broad Institute, where he runs or directs the Genomics of Public Health Initiative, and is also deeply engaged with the International Common Disease Alliance, which is what he's going to talk about today. So Ben, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Laura. I'm happy to. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about the International Common Disease Alliance, or ICDA, and really this initiative to try and go from genetic maps to mechanisms to medicine. So when we kind of zoom out and look at where we are in the kind of human genetics community, particularly with complex traits, this is a slide that I'm sure many of you have seen before. There are 70,000+ associations across a huge number of different diseases and traits. And not only are, there's a huge number of different traits, there's also a tremendous amount of progress in a couple of really pioneering disease endpoints. So, there are a bunch of associations to height, which, is interesting and can teach us about genetic architecture and biology, but associations to things like diabetes, schizophrenia, coronary artery disease, inflammatory bowel disease, these diseases and disorders, these kind of common variant associations are kind of starting point for biological clues for what the really underlying pathogenic mechanisms are. So next slide. So the big bottleneck that we have is, how do we go from these associations to really mechanistic insights, which we believe is the sort of required next step to get to the eventual endpoint of novel medicines, new therapies, new treatments, and kind of new drugs for the different conditions that we're looking at. And in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, you see this kind of general linear path where we're trying to go from identification of genetic variant to what genes that variant is influencing, to what cell types that gene is acting in, to what cellular functions that gene is involved in the cell type that is relevant, to then the physiological function that is really kind of driving the pathogenic process. Now, I'm saying pathogenic process, and that's because a lot of the genetic discovery activities that we've pursued thus far have been focused on susceptibility GWAS, what makes you sick versus what doesn't make you sick. And that's a great starting point, but I think with the kind of evolution and expansion of various genetic discovery efforts, we might be able to start ask questions about why some people get sick earlier versus later, or whether there's a different kind of course, or whether you respond to treatment differently. All of those same genetic discovery efforts can be at the front end of this sort of funnel to get from variants to genes to cell types to functions to the actual disease endpoint. how do we actually traverse from these genetic maps all the way through to the physiology and medicine? And the kind of one of the main goals of the ICDA is to kind of try and bring the community together to eliminate the bottlenecks from going from maps to mechanisms to medicines. Now, a key part of that is how do we have as good a map as possible, but also what do we need to do in terms of generating large-scale data sets to understand molecular and cellular mechanisms and consequences of genetic variation in that kind of context, and then eventually relate it to the disease. So here's the kind of overview of some of the kinds of scientific activities that we perceive as being related to this general maps to mechanisms to medicines paradigm. So on the kind of variant identification, on the left-hand side, we've got our kind of genetic discovery efforts, our GWAS, our rare variant association studies, and that gives us a list of variants and genes to try and learn a little bit more about. But we have to go from those variants and genes to what the cell types and the processes are. And so there are some in silico approaches, different enrichment analyses, heritability analyses, Mendelian randomization analyses, those kinds of things that can help us try and interpret the genetic findings. But fundamentally, we also need to develop ways of probing what the molecular and biochemical consequences of genetic variants are if we are going to traverse from maps to mechanisms to medicines. I think the kind of a natural question for these kinds of initiatives, and I'm sure it's one that IHCC has to field a whole bunch as well, is why is now a good time for this particular goal? And I think that the IHC discussions thus far have really illustrated that there are tremendous data sets of genetic and phenotypic data that are sort of increasingly becoming available globally. Some are being assembled now, some are being integrated and linked together. A lot of the work the IHCC is trying to do to harmonize across those cohorts is exactly the kind of work we need to do to start to integrate the different kinds of genetics. But that's just really a starting point. And so that genetic and phenotypic data is also set in a landscape where our ability to molecularly profile, genome edit, develop disease models, and really engage in the kind of large-scale data science necessary to bring it all together is now actually a realizable possibility. And I think that's why there's so much enthusiasm in this space at this moment in time. So to try and drive this process forward, we've assembled an organizing committee. Our co-chairs are Cecilia Lindgren and Eric Lander, and Rachel Liao is our executive director. And this process was really about trying to, in a sense, go as international as possible. And we're mainly going to get work done through various working groups. So there's an organizing committee, which is this international collaboration across different scientists focused in this area. There are three main subgroups of maps, mechanisms, and medicines that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And then there are these sort of underlying foundational components that I think are really to serve the overall scientific goals. And those include data platforms, also deep integration with the efforts that David Glaser was talking about, alongside Broad and Vanderbilt and many others, as well as this kind of question around data sharing, data governance, and ethics. And I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive in a moment about the data sharing, governance, and ethics, because I'm in the kind of policy session, but I have to have a little bit of science, if you'll forgive me that. And then we also want to bring the other major stakeholders to the table. So having the Funders Council and the Pharma Council really make sure that the scientific activities that we're engaged in are responsive to the needs to the people that are supporting the effort and the work. So for the MAPS working group, I co-chair that with Kristen Willer. And the real goal here is to try and identify what are the fundamental genetic resources that we need to build to ensure that the next generation of genetic studies can be as impactful and diverse and comprehensive as possible, while at the same time integrating not only against biobanks, but also the disease consortia activities. And so we kind of recognize these two large, this sort of dichotomy in genetic study, that on one side we have biobanks, and I think IHCC does a great job of kind of reflecting and representing what the power and potential of biobanks are. But on the other side, we have efforts like the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium or the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Consortium, these international genetics consortia focused on specific disease endpoints. And so part of the work in the MAP space is to try and get these two constituencies talking to each other to get to the best possible analysis for a given disease endpoint. Next slide. Similarly, on mechanisms, again, it's co-led. Again, it's got a kind of remit of trying to understand a little bit more clearly about what those sort of first few biological consequences of a given genetic really are. You can read more about that on the slide. Next slide, please. And then finally, the medicine working group is sort of how do we go from understanding gene regulation? How do we understand, how do we go from understanding the consequences of individual genetic variants that are associated with phenotypes into their broader landscape at a kind of maybe cellular or slightly more physiological level? So how do we kind of synthesize that, which is the sort of biological insight and necessary background knowledge that we need to be able to deliver new medicine? So we've developed a set of recommendations. We're about to release version 1 of the recommendations. You can read about version 0.9 on icda.bio. But in general, the proposals are to have these cross-cutting areas, these MAPS, Mechanisms, and Medicines working group that really drive the foundational resources necessary to conduct this kind of work on any disease. And then at the same time, have a series of flagship diseases that we are identifying and working on bringing together to serve as the sort of test case, the pioneering examples of how do we go from basically as saturated as we can on genetic discovery all the way through to drug development. That's our eventual goal. And how do we make sure that each one of those pieces is really getting the necessary support, data, infrastructure, and expertise required to build towards that path. Next slide. So I just want to end briefly on the COVID-19 host genetics initiative piece for a couple of reasons. One, this is something that we've done in partnership with the ICDA. And I think something that's important to distinguish is that the ICDA itself is not doing this project. The ICDA is creating a forum whereby different communities and constituencies can come together in an organic way to drive scientific progress. And so what we've done here is we've basically, set up a website, allowed different cohorts to register their different studies and their study designs. And the kind of core philosophy is one of an open, a kind of big tent and an open environment and a kind of bottom-up model. So we want the individual studies to be driving what the scientific questions are rather than some sort of kind of top-down, single solution for everything that we're going to do. We've drafted principles of collaboration. These principles of collaboration are what people agree to by joining the effort. And they are, I think, what are now increasingly becoming the standards for large-scale collaborative international consortium kind of science and efforts along those lines. And then the other piece that we're really trying to push the envelope on is actually engagement through Slack. So we've got 954 Slack members on the main channel for discussion of the Coronavirus Host Genetics Initiative. This is a forum where people are sharing everything from recruitment protocols, IRBs, survey data, the kinds of analytic approaches, trying to standardize our pipelines and processes and analyses so that eventually we can bring it all together. And similarly, we've also got a couple of different approaches to data sharing. And I think this is another piece in the policy place, is that there's never going to be one solution to all of our major policy problems. We actually need to have a diverse portfolio of approaches to be able to maximize the scientific insights while still respecting the rules and regulations and the compliance considerations for each of the individual efforts. So in some instances, people can share individual level data. We love that. We're very supportive of that. We want to encourage and engage with that as much as possible. But we also recognize that not every data set can be shared in that kind of manner. And as a result, we also have a kind of much more federated approach to allow for sharing of summary statistics rather than individual level data, so we can get to the best possible science while respecting the rules of engagement for each of the different cohorts. And so to conclude, we've got our kind of first analysis of susceptibility. You can read about all of our analysis plans and all of those things online. If you have any questions or want to be added to the Slack or have anything else that you'd like to raise, feel free to follow up. But again, this is kind of one of these international consortium efforts where each of the individual groups have submitted summary statistics adhering to the general principles of the analysis plan that we put together. And so we're starting to actually, deliver initial results. Now, there are no obvious findings for host, genetic susceptibility to at least I mean, it's probably a blend of susceptibility and severe outcome given the biases in testing, but in any event, it does not like this is going to be a straightforward win. And so with that, I'll conclude. Hopefully I've tried to keep the time approximately. If you want to learn more, feel free to read at icda.bio, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Ben. And now our next speaker is Lindsay Shadegg from the World Economic Forum's Precision Medicine team. And she is going to talk to us today about the work she's been doing around precision medicine generally in terms of her team, but also specifically her focus on data governance issues across international borders and how to facilitate data sharing across those borders through governance procedures. So Lindsay?
Great. Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Shadegg, as Laura mentioned, and I'm based over in San Francisco at the World Economic Forum's Policy Lab. So good morning to all of you. I know you've been on the line for a few hours. We're just getting started with our day. It's 7:15 over here. So looking forward to sharing more on our work. So I have termed this presentation Co-Designing Global Governance Policies, because that is really what our team is focused on. And Benjamin mentioned in his presentation that, there is no one-size-fits-all policy. There is no singular policy that is going to work for every use case. And really what we're trying to do is take a longer-term look at how we can start somewhere and evolve policies down the road that can be applied, scalable, and just generally helpful to advance different collaborations. So I'm going to very briefly touch on the World Economic Forum, because one question I often get is, why is an institution with economics in the name working on healthcare? Happy to clarify that. Also go over briefly our work across our portfolio, and then dive into our project on health data sharing and how to get involved if you're interested. I did want to mention, of course, that we are in quite a fascinating time with COVID-19. The World Economic Forum has established a partnership with the World Health Organization to galvanize the private sector to act together to respond across a number of pillars. So if you'd like to get involved with that, you can find out more on that link. So I wanted to do a quick poll. Hopefully this won't take too long. Have you ever heard that the World Economic Forum is actively working to advance precision medicine? And this will sort of lead how much time I spend on various parts of this presentation. So 33% said yes, and 68% said no. So I'll just briefly touch on this. So the World Economic Forum is the international organization for public-private cooperation. What that means is we are equally funded by the public and private sector. Our mission overall and all of our projects align to ultimately try to improve the state of the world. What does that mean? Many things across our portfolios, but we ultimately try to bring together multi-stakeholder groups to tackle the world's toughest problems. Everything from private, public, academia, startups, technology providers, all 9 yards, to ultimately try to curate independent consortiums. We are best known in our 50-year tenure for having an annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland every January. We also do a summer Davos every June in China. But in the last 20 years here, we've actually begun curating 18 specific platforms that are ultimately trying to just create global collaborations around specific groupings, one of which is healthcare. So quickly here is the holistic platform called Shaping the Future of Health and Healthcare. It really goes down into two different groupings. The first aim is to transform healthcare delivery systems, which of course precision medicine falls under, and our work there. But we also want to try to keep populations healthy. And each of those pillars, those 6 there, represent an entire portfolio of multiple projects underway. Here's also a list of many of our key partners who are actively supporting our work. Another question I get a lot is, who do you work with? This is just a snippet of the private sector. So now a bit into the actual work we do on precision medicine. So this is a very new area for the forum. We really started working on this in 2017 when we established a policy lab here in San Francisco called the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Precision medicine was identified as a key area of focus for the future of healthcare delivery, and most crucially, an emerging area of technology that needed to be really better understood. Specifically, we had many governments claiming they were excited about genomics, excited about a personalized approach to healthcare, but they did not know how to actually tackle it from a policy perspective. And so that is really where we are, and we are trying to develop policies to really maximize the benefits and minimize any risks or possible setbacks in delivering a precision medicine approach to healthcare. When we began thinking about how to approach this topic, these 6 barriers really emerged. And I don't need to tell anyone on the line that data sharing and infrastructure is really the biggest beast to tackle, because there are so many complicated regulatory components as well as technology components that are blocking the scale of data we need to advance precision medicine. So for the first pilot project that we decided to take on, it's called Breaking Barriers to Health Data, and it's getting at this barrier. What can we do to develop policies that can try to unlock the various data silos that we have globally in order to advance precision medicine and ultimately try to move forward holistically and collaboratively? So the Breaking Barriers to Health Data project really at its core is trying to facilitate a proof of concept. If we know that there are genomic and other types of sensitive health data silos globally, how can we begin to bring those together ultimately for patient benefit? And a federated data system is, of course, a great solution to that, where you remotely access data sets without the data ever physically leaving its country of origin. And we were very lucky to partner with 4 different countries on this, and then 4 different genomics institutes within those countries to really begin to just explore this problem and try to begin developing policies that could work and evolve as we move forward. And really one of the most natural use cases that came up, especially led by the very strong patient community, was we need more answers around rare disease. If we can increase our data access, we can not only diagnose more rare diseases, but we can also provide more personalized treatments to the millions of people worldwide with a rare disease that currently have no treatment options available. The project started in July 2018 and is about to conclude here next month when we launch the final deliverable. And we were very lucky to have a fellow seconded to us from Kaiser Permanente for 18 months to work on this project. He just wrapped up his fellowship last month, but it was a true pleasure to work with Arthur, if any of you know him, and he was right alongside our team every day in San Francisco. So the deliverables, and really what I was eager to share. This project really emerged with 3 different products. The first question that we faced was, of course, what is the technical scope? What is a federated data system in layman's terms that government officials and policymakers are going to understand? It turns out it is, in fact, not a super complicated technology, but it does require some dissecting. So that was really the step 1 that we released back in August of 2019, and the link to see further. The 30th question, actually, though, was who is going to pay for this? And I'm sure many of you have faced that, but that was actually the biggest sticking point. What is the monetary benefit of sharing data? We know that, of course, it is a huge benefit to patients, and if you get a diagnosis, much less a treatment, it can transform your life, but that actually was not enough. And so we were very lucky to work with 5 of the leading health economists, 1 from each country represented in this pilot, to develop a full economics framework. And it turns out that there is not enough data, of course, to really understand this topic fully, but we do believe there is a very real return on investment to investing in a federated data system, which is very important to continue to track and understand. And then the final policy component is, of course, how in the world do you run a federated data system for genomic data and other sensitive health data? And this was a very lengthy 1.5-year co-design process that we went underway. And it really came down to 3 central questions. How can you ensure operational efficiency? How can you ensure patient privacy? And how can you ensure security? And that is done and currently being thoroughly reviewed by 2 of the genomics institutes, and will be released next month, along with the How to Federate 101 guide for other interested parties looking to potentially move into genomic data consortiums. So the biggest issue here is, of course, to scale. This is not a one and done endeavor where we figured it out, a policy works, and that's it. We really want to see this scale. And one particular use case we looked at in a summit held last November with Tsinghua University was there are incredible data troves in China. How could China, not cross-border, but just nationally, begin to also federate data for rare disease and hopefully adopt some of these learnings and policies and actually leverage governance to maximize the benefits of federating? And then if you click one more time, sorry, this slide, there you go, thank you. And also right now, I'm very happy to announce that we are leveraging the same policy framework for COVID-19. So we are right now working with public health authorities to figure out how the same privacy, security, operational efficiencies leveraged from a genomic data consortium can be applied to wearables to track the spread of COVID-19. And really, how can we maximize the public health benefit of consumer technology in the same policy specific way, where you're not sort of in the dark moving forward without any guidance on what policy measures need to be put in place to make your efforts successful. So that's a bit of our work, and we always welcome additional community members, whether it's just attending our workshops to think about and talk about these projects, or just making yourself available as a subject matter expert, all the way up to piloting a project. And that's all from me. Thank you so much for your time, and Laura, back over to you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. We did have a question from George Vandenberg as well, and if it's a short question, then perhaps we can sneak it in before the minute changes and we're off the half hour.
Yeah, I see that it's this duplication in the global genetic space. I think for the most part, the geneticists are reasonably good at building towards the latest and greatest analysis with each time an analysis is pursued. I think overall the duplication is pretty modest to small, given that there is a kind of will and desire to move to the best possible approach.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to thank all of our speakers for today. I learned a great deal, and I hope everyone else did as well. And I'll turn it back to you, Terry.